follow along and the answer. Let's start with our first topic now, advanced Excel. Really one of the dividing lines between ordinary users and advanced users is the ability to use mixed cell references. So in this first example, we're going to talk about one of the most important Excel concepts, mixed cell references, but we'll also talk about creating a budget. Now, here's our budget. We're going to have sales in the first row, a bunch of expenses, and then we'll calculate expense and net income. Now, when you do a budget, numbers change all the time, so we don't want to sit here and type numbers here. We create an assumption table where we put our formula inputs. These are our assumptions for our budget. We build formulas up here based on these formula inputs, then we can change these and everything updates. All right, let's see how to create this budget without mixed cell references, and then we'll see the power that using mixed cell references can bring us. All right, so I'm going to click in this cell January. I'm going to say equals and click on
Gentlemen,
How are you doing here? Who are you?
Now these cells here need to be increased based on the previous month's revenue by 4.75%. So I'm going to equals one cell to my left times, in parentheses, 1 plus our percentage change or assumed steady revenue increase. Now, relative cell references, we move this way, that we need the blue box to look at the prior month's revenue. So that's a relative cell reference, one cell to my left. But that B17, when I copy the formula, I need to lock it down or make it absolute on 475. So what do? We hit the F4 key. That puts the $2 signs in. F4 key, amazing. It's quite nice because we're always making relative, absolute, and later mixed cell references. All right, Control Enter. Puts the formula in the cell and keeps the cell selected. A little fill handle in the lower right-hand corner. I move my cursor, and when I see my crosshair or angry rabbit, I click and drag. Be sure to click on the last cell and hit F2 and verify that the formula worked. Relative cell reference and absolute. Now let's create our expenses, and this is how the vast majority of humans on the planet Earth would do something like this. And not only that, as an educator, this is how every textbook I've ever used to teach it shows people how to create a bunch of expenses for a budget. Ready? Equals January revenue. We copy down. We need to lock down on B5, so I'm going to hit the F4 key. That's January's revenue times the percentage of those revenues that are used up with expense 1, 17%. Now that's a relative cell reference. Notice our expenses are listed in our calculating table vertically, and thus our expense percentages and the labels down here are also listed vertically. Control Enter and copy it down. Now it'd be great if I could just copy this formula down and over through this whole sea of green for our expenses, but no, if you only can use relative and absolute, you have to come here and create a second formula. F4 to lock that times, hey, this 17% again. Control Enter, copy it down. Now I'm going to hit F4 here, F2 to put it in edit mode. I don't want to do that. That means I have to create 6 different formulas, when in fact, if you know how to use mixed cell references, you could do this whole sea of formulas by creating one, copying it down and over. So let's see how to do this. I'm going to hit the keyboard shortcut for delete. Oh, it's delete. Delete content. All right. Now let's create our formula here. Equal sign. And I actually want to click on this revenue and talk about just this one cell reference and introduce the references. Now for this column, do all of our expense formulas need that January revenue? Yes, they do. So going down, it needs to be locked. But what about when we copy the formula over? Does it need to be locked on January, or should it be looking at February? It should be looking at February. Relative cell reference. So as we copy the formula this direction, that blue box should be moving. That means what? Copy down, it needs to be absolute or locked. Copy it across the columns, it needs to be relative cell reference. That means we need one of each depending on the direction. So check this out. I'm going to Control Enter and do a little trick here. This is the sledgehammer method of learning how to do mixed cell references. I'm going to copy this formula over, and then I'm going to copy it down. All right, so I'm going to hit F2 here. Notice B5, tab, F2, C5. So the B changed to C, which is what we want, right? It looks like as we copy our formula across the columns, we want to let that column reference move. Escape, F2. Okay, so B5, enter, F2. Wait a second, the B5 changed to B6, and we didn't want it to change to B6. So really, if we want that 6 to remain a 5, we have to come up to this original formula and lock just the row reference 5 and not the column reference B. Now check this out. Here's the magic of this F4 key here. Let's hit the F4 key once. That's absolute, meaning it's locked in both directions. F4. Oh, that's awesome. I hit it a second time, and now it's toggling. It's giving me the opportunity to take row lock, but not the column. If I hit the F4 again, notice, oh, now the column is locked, meaning it's absolute, and the row is relative. If I hit the F4 key a fourth time, back to relative. So check this out. I'm going to hit F4. It's a merry-go-round key that toggles through all the different cell references. So the one I really want for the first part of our formula is $5, meaning the column's not locked, the row is. Control-Enter, copy it over one. That's looking good. Copy it down one. B5, C5. Absolutely perfect. Now, let's amend this formula. I'm going to hit the F2. We got that first one, learning about for the first time the idea of mixed cell references. But now I'm going to times and complete our formula. We have our expense one. Now, when you're building a formula like this in edit mode and you're not copying to the side and look at what is moving and what is not, here's another trick. Well, there's two directions we're copying it down and over. So I'm going to ask of that one cell reference, what do I want it to do when I copy down? Is it absolute or relative? What do I want to do when I copy the side? Is it absolute locked or relative? All right, so when I copy down, do I want B18 to change to B19? Yes. So when I copy down, I want relative, so no $sign in front of the row reference. What about when I copy it to the side? Do I want the B to change to C? Well, no, because that means the green box would be looking at nothing there. So in this case, we need the $sign. I'm going to hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times. There it is, that beautiful expense formula. Two different types of mixed cell references, one with only the row locked, one with only the column locked. Control-Enter, copy it down, copy it over, and when you drag through a table of formulas like that, you go to the diagonally furthest one away, hit F2, and admire your handiwork. Look at that. Did it work? It's got the June revenue, and it's got expense 6. That is the best example I can think of to show the power of mixed cell references. Now, one other really important thing before we move on to some other examples. Notice we have our expense labels here, and then the use of our percentages down here, orientated the same way in the calculating table as in the assumption table. Now let me scroll down here and show you what you never want to do, even though a lot of the textbooks I use present students with problems like this. You have your labels orientated in your calculating table vertical, but in your assumption table they're listed horizontal. You can never use mixed cell references. Orientating vertically in the calculating table and horizontally in the assumption table means you can only create 6 different formulas, no possibility of mixed cell references. So that's one of the golden rules of using mixed cell references. So how do we finish this? Total expenses. Hey, check this out. There's a keyboard shortcut for auto sum, Alt equals. But anytime you do Alt equals or even click the sum button, it tries to guess. So always look. Do we want the revenues in total expenses? No. Here's a great trick. You can change the range by pointing to the corner. When you see that little diagonal cursor, you can drag your range down. Control-Enter. And then what's the formula for net income? Equals our sales minus our total expenses. And of course, those are formulas with relative cell references. So when I highlight both of these different formulas and drag them over with my Angry Rabbit, boom, there we have completed our budget. But the essence, mixed cell references. Now we want to go look at some other great examples. We're going to go over to sheet number 2. Actually, before we on each one of these tricks, there'll always be a few notes and reference videos. Mixed cell references is the reason it's the divided line between advanced and non-advanced is because it's a hard concept to assimilate and use fluently. Here's a great video with 15 amazing examples from super simple all the way to the more complex. And so for each one of these tricks, there'll be a link for some other videos. Hey, let's go over to trick number 2. Now, conditional formatting. Conditional formatting, we can do all sorts of things. In 2007 and later on the home ribbon, conditional formatting has amazing built-in features. But guess what? A lot of the cool advanced conditional formatting tricks are not built in and require that you know how to do logical true-false formulas. Here's a great example. I'm going to click escape. Highlighting an entire row. So here's our criteria. I want to highlight the entire students row for student information where grade is greater than 3.5. So that would mean going like this, right? And then highlighting it like a yellow. But if I change this to 2.5, I want that to automatically change so a different row is highlighted. All students with greater than 2.8 or equal to 2.5. I'm going to Control Z to undo. This trick requires that you know mixed cell references. Now, when you're doing what's called a logical true-false formula for conditional formatting, especially when you're learning how, or even more advanced, complex formulas, it's nice to build them in the cell and see if you can get the patterns of trues and falses you need for conditional formatting off to the side. Once you get the formula working, then you copy and paste it into the conditional formatting dialog box. Because get this, every single cell in this range in memory, meaning the conditional formatting dialog box, is going to have a true-false formula. So for this row, cell A5, B5, all of these cells need to have the word true in them in order to get that formatting. All right, so I've just, that's the range we want to do. I have a similar range over here. Let's build our logical true-false formula. Now, what's true for this cell? Well, that 3.7 has to be greater than that, but also for this. So this cell actually needs to be looking there and asking the question, are you greater than or equal to that? Same with this one, same with this one. But notice, if that cell needs to be looking right there, this entire row, when I copy the formula down, it needs to move. It can no longer look there. It now needs to look there. Mix cell references to the rescue. So you ready? Here's our formula. Equals E5. Now, when I copy it this way, I need to lock it down on the E5, but when I copy down, it needs to move to the next one. So you ready? I'm going to hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times. So when I copy it this way, always locked on the 3.7. When it copies down, it moves to the 3. Let's just see if this works. Control Enter. Copy it across the columns and down the rows. And you can pick any one you want. Is that not magic? Look at that. Now, that needs to be amended. We need to ask a logical formula question. Now, logical formulas always come out with only one of two answers, true or false. So I need to say, are you greater than or equal to? That is a comparative operator. Notice there's no single greater than or equal to. You got to use two characters. Are you greater than or equal to the hurdle? Now, that cell reference, no matter where you are in the sea of formulas, needs to be locked down, so I hit the F4 key. That is a logical formula. Control Enter, copy it over, and double click and send it down. Now notice, look at that. True, because this student has a 3.8, which is greater than or equal to 3.5. Similarly here. Now, when you do this, when we're over here, we're gonna have to highlight this range and invoke the conditional formatting dialog box. The active cell means that whatever you paste into the dialog box, the formula has to be from the point of view of that cell. So notice that formula right there is from the point of view of that cell. So I'm going to copy it, Control C in edit mode. Highlight this entire range. Now conditional formatting over here, something like new rule. The keyboard shortcut is Alt-O-D. So that's Alt-O-D. And then you say new rule. You read through the list. It says use a formula. So use a formula. I'm going to click there and Control V. So that formula in this dialog box will conditionally format in the row. You can format whatever you want. I'm going to do yellow, something simple. Click OK. Click OK. 3 clicks in 2007 and later click OK. And just like that, if I change this down here, 2.5, boom. For 3.75, only one. All right, and these formulas have nothing to do with this setup over here. This is just for learning or creating. Let's go look at another great example. By the way, there's conditional formatting. This video has 30 examples, basically everything you ever could possibly want to know. And some of the big videos I have for links down here, same thing. When you go to the video, it has a hyperlink table of content with minute mark hyperlinks. Let's go to our next example. Now I want to conditionally format either the min or the max value for each student. So notice, that means I need to have our formula look only at this row. So the max here would be 49, and I want that green. The max for this student would be 49. The max for this student would be 43. All right, so notice this range right here. We're going to do that same thing. Have a parallel range over here. Build the formula in this cell right here. Equals, well, what finds the biggest value? The max function. And for this student, I want just this row. Now, check this out. When I copy the formula this direction, it needs to be locked on C5 to F5. But when I copy down to the next student, that whole range needs to move. So this is an example of when you have a range of cells that needs to be locked in one direction. When we copy across the column, it's locked, but move relatively when we copy down across the row. So I'm going to hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times. The C and the F are locked, but not the 5s. Control Enter. And let's just copy this over and prove to ourselves that our mixed cell reference for a range is working. I'm going to copy it down. Anywhere you click, you can see, wow, that's amazing. Mixed cell references on a range. Now we have to ask the question, because remember, for conditional formula, each cell must have a true-false formula, right? So I'm going to come here. Okay, so since the whole row is asking the question of 49, I'm just going to say, is 49 equal to? Now that's a comparative operator. Just, are you equal to? Is that max equal to? Relative cell reference. Notice as I copy it over and down, the little C5 will move as a relative cell reference. Control Enter. Copy it across and double click and send it down. So any cell you look in, is that not amazing? So we have a range of cells with mixed cell references and comparing against a single relative cell reference. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy from the upper leftmost corner, Control C, escape, highlight this range, invoke conditional formatting, Alt-O-D, and see that N right there, Alt-N. I need to go down, so arrow, 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 and tab. I Control V and pick whichever formatting I want. I'm going to pick more colors because I like that green right there. So, okay, 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 3 okay. So, there we go. And if you change this, right, this is dynamic, right? Now let's do the min. And I'm going to do this one in the dialog box. You know, if you get fluent with how to do conditional formatting with logical formulas, you don't have to do it off. So I've highlighted the range, Alt-O-D, Alt-N, arrow. All right, so you ready? Here's how you do it. You say, is that cell? Now notice when you use this dialog box, clicking on a cell, the default is absolute. So I'm going to have to hit F4, 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 relative cell reference. Hey, is any cell in this range equal to the min? And I'm going to highlight that range. By default, it's locked. I want it locked on the column reference, but not the row, so I'm going to hit F4 1, 2 times. parentheses. So that formula right there will work. Format, and then you can do whatever color you want. I'm going to use red, and that's a dark value color. So if it's a dark value color, I'm going to select a light value font color. I'll select white. Click OK, click OK, click OK. I'm going to change this to 12. It's totally dynamic. Conditional formatting, not only with a logical formula, but also with mixed cell references. Let's go over to our next example. We want to click on sheet 4 and totally change directions here. We want to talk about the amazing sum product function. We're actually going to see example 4 to 7, 4 examples of the sum product function. Now, this is an example from finance, actually from economics and accounting too. We need to estimate what's called expected return, or expected. It's a type of weighted average. And this is a stock example. So we're estimating the future. And, you know, the future is unknown, so we do our best to estimate it. We think there's a 15% probability that the economy will be in boom, 30% it will be normal, and 55% it will be bust. And from past data, we have estimates of what the stock A returned in boom, normal, and bust. So we need to do what's called, again, a weighted average expected return calculation here. Well, if you look at the algorithm, the formula, it says this. Well, take the stock return times the probability plus stock return times probability plus stock return times probability. Now notice what we've done here. In essence, we've taken these values and multiplied them by this. In essence, we took a column, 1, 2, 3, and multiplied it by another column and then added it. All right? Another way to look at this is we could take the probability times the return, relative cell references, copy it down, and then add it up. Alt equals is the keyboard shortcut for AutoSum. Either way you do it, we are doing two things. Notice, enter F2, enter F2. It's as if we have one column times another, and then we add it. Anytime you have that, you can use the sum product function. Now, what does product mean? To multiply. What does sum mean? To add. That's why they called it the sum product. It means you're going to product first, then sum. So in essence, this is what the sum product function can do. All in a single cell without all of this typing and without these extra cells. You take multiply column 1 times column 2. That's step 1. That's the product. And then you simply add the result, right? So here it is. Amazing, the sum product function. It wants array 1, array 2, meaning a range of values. It doesn't matter in which order we take these columns, because multiplication can be done in any order. I'm going to take array 1 and array 2, and that's it. It'll do the heavy lifting for us. That is totally amazing. Sum product. All right, now let's look at another example where we lock one range and not the other. Here we have stock A, B, and C. We have these probabilities, so we can do equals sum product. Now notice, if you haven't been taking advantage of this since 2007, once I've typed SUMP, the function I want is highlighted in bold. I can simply hit tab. That's since 2007 we've been able to do that. All right, so multiply the probabilities, and this I need lock, so I hit the F4 key, comma, and the second array, those are relative cell references. Sum product, 1 absolute, 1 relative, control enter, and copy it over. All right, let's go look at our next example for sum product, number 5. Hey, this is a weighted grade situation. So we have test 1, 2, and 3, but we have weights. Test 1 is worth 25% E grade, then test 2 is 25, and test 3 is 0.5. So how are we going to get the total? Because I want to calculate a percentage grade, so I need to compare this 199 to this 250. Oh, but wait a second, I can't do this straight comparison because each one of these has a different weight. So we'll calculate the actual weighted total for not only the max possible in the class, but all the individual scores, and then we'll do our division to calculate our percentage grade. Well, this is perfect for the sum product. Sum product, well, actually, what's the long way, right? Equals this times the weight plus the test times the weight plus the test times the weight. Anytime you have that situation, 1, 2, 3, in essence, times 1, 2, 3, and then add, boom, sum product is much faster and more efficient. Oh, I forgot to lock those there. So I'm going to F4, Control Enter, double click and send it down. All right, so those are our target values. I don't want to have to do it, so I simply do the sum product. Sum product, oh, these are relative cell reference there, comma, and I'm going to take these as absolutes. Now, one important thing about the sum product, these two arrays or ranges have the same dimension, meaning 1 row times 3 columns, 1 row times 3 columns. Anytime you have that situation where you have the same dimensions, multiplying and then adding, boom, sum product is absolutely perfect. Now we have our maximum possible points for the score there. So I simply come here and say equals 1 cell to my left divided by, and I'm going to hit the F4 key. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Double click and send it down as long as you have, it goes down until it sees a blank right here and stops. Absolutely amazing. But the saving grace here was sum product. Let's go look at another example. So this is in accounting. We have an accounting department, and our goal is for budgeting purposes, we need to calculate budgeted monthly order quantity. So we have some product. And from past accounting data, 10% of the time we ordered 500 for the month, 15% of the time 600, all the way down to the bottom. Anytime you have a relative frequency distribution like this, or we could easily call this probability, all of these better add up to 1, which they do. But how in the world do we calculate a weighted average or a mean or expected value for budgeting purposes? No problem. This, whatever the number is times the probability, number times the probability, number times the probability, and then you add them all up. Sum product comes to the rescue. Sum product, I simply take all of the numbers, those are the actual number quantity purchased, times their associated probabilities. Expected value or weighted average, 790. Now we can use this to calculate a budgeted income statement. Well, we have our price that we're going to charge, and for here's our cost, and here's our assumed units sold, right? So this is the selling number, right? Here's for what our budgeted amount for the number we bought. So I come over here and for sales, I say $125 times the assumed units sold. But for expenses, I have to take the cost times this calculated weighted average, right? And so now I can come up here based on this number here. We can calculate our gross profit, sales minus our expenses. All right, so again, the beauty of sum product there. We have our fourth example, and this one gets takes it one step further. Now let's just look at this. Over here, this was pretty straightforward. It's one column times another, and then we actually had 3 examples. We had a finance one, expected value. We had a grading weighted average, and an accounting example here. But in all these cases, the key is column times column, where every single individual item in the 2 columns were of interest. We needed to multiply every item and add. Our next example gets a little complicated here. What do we want here? We want to calculate ultimately what's called a weighted average, and we're calculating it from transactional data. So here we have some transactions. Now, weighted average, notice for item 2 we bought 312 at 19.20, but down here on a different date for item 2 we bought 432 at $20.50. So in order to calculate a weighted average, we could come out here and calculate an individual column, right? Say 312 times this 19.20. Then we actually have the total amount we need for this one transaction, right? That is the amount. If I double click and send it down, if I could add for item 2, this one, and this one, and all of these. Now down here in the status bar, you can see I've highlighted some non-contiguous cells not next to each other. I use the control key to do that. It gives me the sum. That's the number I need. That total divided by the addition of all of those, and that would be the sum down here, 1546. If I could do that calculation, that would give me the weighted average cost for one item number 2, and that's our goal here to calculate over here. All right, but check this out. It would be easy enough. Notice our pattern here for some product. Enter F2. We're actually multiplying 2 columns and then adding. But what's the problem here? We actually have a condition. We're only interested in these ones. So how in the world are we going to use some product and isolate? Please just multiply this, then this, then this, then this, and then add. No problem, some product can do it, but we're going to have to get tricky because we have a condition. And what's our condition here? Please do it just for item 1. What's our condition here? Please do it just for item 2. I'm going to start off in this cell just because we were talking about item 2. Well, let's start with the easy part, array 1, array 2. Well, I'm just going to take all of these. And I'm going to hit the F4 key, multiply that times array number 2. I'm going to do this one right here, F4. Ooh, but we don't want all of them. That's where the third array is going to come in. Now, what is true for this particular sum product calculation in this cell? I need only items 2. So for this next array, I'm going to highlight this column. That has all the criteria, right? Notice 1, 2, 3, they're all the same dimension too. I'm going to lock it. But I'm going to use a comparative operator, the equal sign, and say, please, only the ones there that are equal to 2. Now, here's a great trick when you're building a big formula like this, and you have a certain element you want to see what it evaluates to. I can use the F9 key. I'm going to highlight just that little part and hit the F9 key. Now, notice it gives me a string of trues and falses, which is what an array calculation, a logical calculation does. True, true, and then true, true. That's our pattern of trues for this item 2. But guess what? Some product does not understand those trues and falses. Now I'm going to Control Z because I don't want to evaluate that. By the way, there's another little trick here I just learned the other day. If you, in the screen tip, click on Array 2, Array 1, it highlights just that little part, and then you can hit the F9 key. I love that. Control Z. Now, some product cannot understand those trues and falses, so we need to convert those trues and falses to 1s and 0s. That equal sign right there, I need to force it to calculate first. So I'm going to put parentheses around it. And then we could multiply by 1. Any math operation on trues and falses will convert them to 1s and 0s. I could multiply by 1, divide by 1, but the fastest calculating method is to use the unitary operator minus or negation and do 2 double negatives. 2 double negatives will actually calculate much faster than multiplying by 1 or dividing by 1. But check this out. However you do it, when you highlight this now, actually, let's do our little trick here. Array 3, when I hit the F9 key, boom. That's a string of 1s and 0s. We can do Boolean math now, and guess what? Only when it gets a 1 times the associated value in that range times the associated value there will it give us the result. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those 1s represent item 2, item 2, item 2, item 2. I'm going to undo this, and now some product can do its work. That formula right there will calculate the total costs associated with item 2 from a transactional data set. Control Enter, and then drag it down and up. But that's only part of the calculation for a weighted cost. We need now to add up the total units for item 2, item 3, and item 1.
Yes.
We can simply use the SUMIFS function. Now, the SUMIFS function is a function that came in 2007 or later. It's great. You can add with 1 or more criteria. Now, notice something. The reason we're allowed to just use a simple function like SUMIFS and don't have to know that some product function is we're simply adding with 1 criteria, not multiplying and then adding. So the sum range, we'll need to add up units underneath the F4 key, comma. Criteria range, that range right there. And by the way, we could use the sum if function because we're adding with one criteria. But the thing I liked about sum ifs is that the screen tip properly labels all of the arguments that go into it, so there's less confusion when using this function. I'm going to hit the F4 key, and then finally, comma, please give me the criteria. That's item 1. So it's going to look through here, find item 1, and then add the associated units. Control Enter.
Okay.
I can send it down. Whoops. Control Z to undo. I'm just going to drag it down. There's our units. There's our total cost for each item. Now I can do my weighted average cost. Total for item 1 divided by total units for item 1. Control Enter. Copy it down. All right, so there is our calculation. Now, notice we did have an extra column here. We didn't use that over here, but we don't, let's say we don't want to do that, and we don't want all this extra real estate. We really need a single cell formula to calculate this. Say you have these, this is a template where you're dumping data all the time, so you want just a single cell to tell you what the weighted average cost is for each item. Now notice we did this in 2 steps. That one divided by this. I'm going to go ahead and open up the clipboard. Whoops, clear all. But watch this. I'm going to copy this with the equal sign. That's the first formula. Control C. It's on the clipboard. And then I'm going to copy this without the equal sign. Control C. Escape. Now I can come down here. Ready? I click on the first one. I'm going to, at the end, do a division symbol and click on the second bit. Notice now I've made a mega formula by building it in parts and then putting it all together using the clipboard. Control Enter, and then double click and set it down. Whoa! Control Z. I think what's happening there is 2000. It didn't used to do that before 2010. It's interpreting this as a data set. So I'm just going to copy that down there. Now, if you're really using this for some calculations where you don't want all these extraneous pennies, you actually want to be rounded to 18 and to 27 and to 39. Use the round function instead of number formatting, because the round function will actually round the number and get rid of those extra decimals. Now notice we're using the round. That mega formula there is in the number, but I simply come to the end, comma, and if I want to round to the penny, 1, 2, the penny is 2 decimals in, so you have to put a 2 in the numbers digit. Control Enter, and double click and send it down. Wow, that is amazing. Sum Product comes to the rescue. We saw 4 great examples for Sum Product. Let's go to our next example. Let's close this clipboard, and then I'm going to use these scroll arrows to scroll over to the next sheet. Now we're going to scroll over and expose sheets 8 to 11. Now we're going to go over to sheet 8. I'm going to click on the 8. We're going to talk about VLOOKUP. Now, VLOOKUP basics really shouldn't be in an advanced video. But I'm going to go over the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page about what VLOOKUP does, and then we're going to look at some great advanced examples. VLOOKUP, the V is for vertical. Now, what does VLOOKUP do? VLOOKUP simply delivers a value to a cell. Now, we're going to look at the exact match first, and then we'll look at approximate match. All VLOOKUP does is in this cell, we're going to have the VLOOKUP function. It's going to look up Bellin. Here's the table. It'll look in the first column. It'll find an exact match of Bellin because that's the lookup value. It'll then go over to column 4, get that price, bring it back to this cell. Now, we never want to do this by hand. That's why there's lookup functions like VLOOKUP. Again, V is for vertical because the items in the first column we're looking up are orientated vertical. What is VLOOKUP going to do? It's going to look something up and deliver a value to the cell. Equals VL tab. VLOOKUP needs the lookup value. Hey, I'm looking up the product. The name of the boomerang product is Bellin, comma. You got to tell VLOOKUP where the table is, so I'm going to highlight this table. Comma, column index. That's you telling VLOOKUP which one of these columns, 1, 2, 3, or 4, has the item you want to throw back in the cell. 4, column 4 has the price, so I'm going to type a 4. And then finally, comma, there's a fourth argument, approximate or exact. Now I'm going to use 1 for true and 0 for false. It's actually approximate match you can leave out because it's the assumed default. The only time you have to use the fourth argument is if you use an exact match, and I'm going to put a 0. What does exact match mean? It means when it's looking up Bellin, if it can't find exactly Bellin, it will return an NA error, which means not available. That's it. VLOOKUP is amazing. Now I can type quad, and it looks up immediately the price, $35.95. Now, VLOOKUP without data validation drop-down list sometimes seems silly, so I'm going to show you how to, because watch what happens. If I accidentally type quad in a space, it looks like I typed quad, and it's properly saying it's not available because there's an extra space there. So I really want to use what's called data validation drop-down list to prevent this error from happening. Quad. All right, so I click in the cell, I go to the data ribbon, I go to data validation, and then data validation. It's very simple. We're not going to allow anything in this cell except for the items from the first column of the table. Allow what for data validation? I don't want to allow any value. I want a list. I simply click in the source, highlight. There we have it. From now on, we're going to have an in-cell drop-down that will only allow those values. Now I can simply go Bellin and Carlota, and it looks exact match. Now let's look at what's called approximate match. So your sales are 150,000, and we need the commission rate. Tax tables are another great example. Now the way you create your tables for approximate match, you have to be very careful. The first column, this column is not part of our table. I'm just going to use it to help us understand how it works. That's the first column. It has to be sorted ascending from smallest to biggest. But check this out. This is approximate match because there is no 100 and, well, I don't want 150,000, I want 15. How about we'll start with 1,500 first. I want to figure out what the commissions are, right? But when I'm looking this up, there is no exact match. Well, here's how it's going to work. Here's the category, 1,500. Well, it fits in this category right here. This number is greater than or equal to 1,000 and less than 2,500. So this is the row in the table. This $20 should be dumped back in the cell. But how does it know to do that? Here's a metaphor to describe how it does it. When VLOOKUP does approximate match, it puts 1,500 in its brain. It comes racing through the first column, and when it bumps into the first value bigger, it jumps back one row, and that's how it determines which row to get the commission, bring it back to the cell. Technically, it does a binary search, which is very quick, and I have other videos on that topic down here. But that metaphor, bumping into the first bigger one and jumping back, is a great way of perfectly understanding how the VLOOKUP works. All right, VLOOKUP, I'm going to say look up this 1,500, comma, within what? The table. First column always has the value you're looking up. In this case, it's approximate, so these are sorted from smallest to biggest. Comma, which column number? 1, 2, 3. Notice we're in D, which is the fourth letter in the alphabet. It's not 4. It's the actual size of the table. So 1, 2, 3. So I put a 3 for column index. And forget it. This lookup range, anytime you see square brackets in an argument for a screen tip, that means if you know the default, you don't have to put it. And I know the default. It's approximate match, so I'm leaving it out. That's a simple formula there, VLOOKUP, to always get the right commission rate. All right, so if I type 7,500 here, it better give me $250. Now check this out. Here's how this approximate match works. If I type something smaller than the first value, which of course I wouldn't do here, minus 50, it's working perfectly. It says, hey, not available. But if I type something way bigger than the biggest value in the table, I type 150,000, it's just going to go racing down. It can't find anything bigger than it, so it takes the last one. It takes that 700 and throws it in the cell. So guess what? Approximate match and exact match. Those are the two things that VLOOKUP does. Let's go over to sheet number 9. Here's VLOOKUP and the match function to do a two-way lookup. Now, how is this a two-way lookup? Well, I need to look up this 2,000 and find this row, and then look up this allowance, find this column, and take the intersecting value. So it's a two-way lookup. I need to know VLOOKUP can figure out the row, but then we have this complication that we're going to have various columns that we need to extract values. Let's just assume for the moment that we're always going to have one allowance. Then the formula is just like we did last video, VL tab. I'm going to look up this 2000 here, comma, within our table, first column is sorted, smallest to biggest, comma, and I'm going to say 1, 2, 3. So I'm just going to assume that the row is going to be coming from the third column. So that's easy enough. If I change this to $4.50, we get $1. 2,900, I'm going to get 3. So that's working just fine. But what if I change this to 5 allowances? I really want that $7 in this cell. So the complication here is that that's changing also. So no problem. Notice right now it's looking at column 1 allowances of the third, 4, 5, 6. It should be changing to 7. Well, guess what? There's something called the match function. And all it does is it looks up an item and tells you the relative position of the item in a list. Well, where is 5 in this row of values? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's exactly right. If I change this to a 1, what's the relative position of in this row? 1, 2, 3. So we can use the match function. It's a lookup function, but when it looks something up within that lookup array there, it's a row of values there, comma, and I'm going to do exact match 0, which is exactly the same as exact match. So I'm going to put a 0 here. Match tells us that 1 is the third item in this list. If I put a 4, it's the 6th item. Now let's go ahead and use this comma to determine the column number. So I'm going to come here for this 3, I'm going to highlight it, and notice that screen tip is inside of VLOOKUP. Column number, but I'm going to Control V. That means the match is now delivering a number, but it's going to deliver it to the column index. So now we get a 6. If I change this to 3, we get a 5. Now, in this particular example here, there's another way we could do this. But this construction of VLOOKUP and match to determine a column number is awesome for all sorts of two-way lookups. When you're looking up some column, some row, and you need the intersecting value. Let's just copy this over here. I'm going to copy this. And right here, I'm going to redo this. And we're going to notice a pattern here, right, for column index. We're never going to need this first column, so we're never going to have that. But what do we really want in column index number if it's 0? Well, we need a 2, right? For this 3, what do we need? 3, that's the 5th one out. So I'm going to just say take whatever the allowances are plus 2. That will always give me the right column number. All right? Change this to 6,000. I better get a 600. I better get a 4, 6,000. I better get a $6 tax. All right, so this one's certainly the more robust way. It'll work in most situations when you're doing two-way lookup, but that one's great here. Now let's go look at another great example. Click on sheet 10, and we're going to see another situation for two-way lookup. But in this example, we have somebody's name here. We want to be able to select whatever name it is and have the record from this table down here appear. So student number 2, I want some of this data, the scores and the final grade, appear right here. Well, this is a classic two-way lookup. We're going to use name to determine the row in this table, and then we can use these field names to determine the column number using the match function. All right, I'm going to scroll in to make this a little bit easier to see. Equals VLOOKUP. I'm going to look up that name, and I'm going to hit the F4 key because we're copying this formula to the side, and we need to lock that down. Comma, the table. Now I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut, Control-Shift-Down arrow, and then Control-Shift right arrow. I've highlighted that table, and I'm going to hit the F4 key. F4 is great because it locks it, which we need, and it jumps our screen back in view. Comma, the column number, we'll use match to do our two-way lookup. What am I looking up? The field name. Comma, within what? The field names from the top of this table, F4 key to lock it, and then comma 0 for exact match. We still have to close off our VLOOKUP. This is an exact match, so we actually have comma, and we're putting exact match 0 for VLOOKUP. All right, ready? Control Enter, and I can copy this over. That is simply amazing. If I select student number 7, there is most of their data from their record extracted. Beautiful. Look at that. Now, how would you do this? We displayed records horizontally. Let's do it vertically. Same exact formula. Watch this. I'm going to so cheat here. I'm going to copy this formula in edit mode, Control C. I'm going to paste this, and watch this. I'm going to drag this, and notice, actually when I start it's a relative cell reference, but I'm just going to drag this over here. Boom. I'm going to drag this one right here. Boom. All the rest of it is the same. Same formula, just looking at this name here and those field names, double click and send it down. So now if I change this to 12, boom, both horizontally and vertically. So VLOOKUP and match, totally great. One great last example, I'm going to click on the sheet 11 for VLOOKUP. Now this is a tax example. So here's our tax table, right? We've all seen this if you've done tax accounting. We have to look up a tax rate, right? So if your income is over 2,038, but not over this, our tax rate is 15, and our tax from the previous brackets is that. Now, how are we going to do VLOOKUP? We literally are in our formula down here. Let's do this by hand. Equals, well, I'm going to need the tax from the previous bracket plus, well, this amount, it says, this is 2,038, it says over that. So that full amount has already been taxed. So we have to take this 2,500 and subtract from this 2,500 that amount to get the remaining amount to tax at 15%. In essence, that's what it says right there. There's a little formula. So in our formula down here, we have to open parentheses, 2,500 minus the amount that's already been taxed. That amount we close off in parentheses, and then we multiply it by that 15%. Now, you can get a hint of how this formula will evolve. We used 1, 2, 3 cells from this row. If we were to do VLOOKUP, guess what? We'd have to do 3 VLOOKUPs in one form. I'm going to hit enter. This is the numbers, right? When I first learned a formula like this, I literally did it by hand, wrote it out like this, and then made some notes to myself. If I was going to do VLOOKUP to look up that 7250 here, right? It's in the 5th column. So VLOOKUP 5 plus whatever's in this C12 minus VLOOKUP 2, because this is the amount that's already been taxed, times VLOOKUP 4. That's the tax rate for this particular variable table here. Now, let's come over here. The only trick here is this table is literally straight from a tax book. It says over. But for VLOOKUP, that amount right there, we need a first column that contains a value that's actually included. Because remember the way VLOOKUP works, it takes this number right here, races through, and it bumps into a first value bigger than it, it jumps back. That number has to be included. So you actually have to add an extra column that has the first possible amount that's allowed in this row right here, which of course is 1 penny bigger, because that label says over. That means that amount is not included, but that is. All right, so you ready? Here it is. Well, first is a VLOOKUP equals VLOOKUP. I'm looking up this amount here, comma, within our table, and I'm going to hit, I don't have to hit F4 here, comma. Well, what's our first amount? It's the 5, because we want that amount, so I'm going to put 5. Now watch this. For a big formula like this, I control enter. You can see it gives us the $72, right? If I were to change this to 19,000, right? That $3,895.80, that's the amount of tax that's already been collected from the earlier bracket. So that's working. Actually, let me control Z. Back to 2,500. But here's a cool trick. We have to use VLOOKUP 3 times, so I'm just going to copy it and change the 5 each time. So now we got the previous bracket plus, we have to take the amount, the total taxable earnings minus, and I'm going to VLOOKUP to get that amount right there, Control V, and simply change that 5 to a 2. Then we close the parentheses off because that amount right there is the total amount taxable for this bracket times and another VLOOKUP. Whereas the tax rate, it's in column 4. You got to be kidding me. That's a huge, gigantic formula, but it does the trick, right? Here, if I was depending on using Excel to calculate this tax, I'd have to redo it every single time. But now I just put 19,000 here, boom, and it calculates. Remember, that one's incorrect. It calculates the correct amount, and these formulas are correct right here. Control Z, VLOOKUP, totally amazing. Some great examples. Let's go to our next topic. I'm going to use these sheet scroll arrows over here to scroll over and expose example number 12. All right, let's look here. Here's a grade table, and we are going to do a VLOOKUP to figure out what the decimal grade is from this table here, but we need to subtract the 2 lowest. So if we added all these up, this would be 400 total. If we wanted to get a percentage grade, we can't use the 400 as our total base. We have to subtract the 2 lowest. Right, so this one's easy. It's 350. That's the max total. But for each one of these students, I don't want to have to do it manually. No problem. There's a great function called the small function. Now, the small has an array, and if you said small and then comma for the k, you said 1, it would give you the minimum. If you said 2, give me the second smallest. If you said 3, the third smallest. But there's a great aspect of this small function and that k argument. If you use array syntax, which means curly bracket, and then you say 1, comma 2, end curly bracket, that's called an array constant. It's a way in some formulas to enter more than one number into a formula simultaneously. That means give me the first and second smallest. So k is not limited to a single number. You can put a single number, 2 numbers, 3 numbers, etc. All right, I'm going to close this off. Now the problem is if I hit enter, it shows me 50. And why? Because if small is delivering 2 numbers, the first and second smallest, a cell can only display 1 number. So let's highlight this whole function here and use our F9 key to evaluate. Boom, you can see it has extracted the 2 smallest. Well, no problem, Control Z. We just need to put those 2 numbers into a function. I'm going to put them in this small function. That means I want to add the 2 lowest, right? So I'm going to close parentheses, Control Enter to put the formula in the cell and keep the cell selected. And now watch this. I'm going to drag down and boom, I don't like that one. I copy a formula. It copies the formula and the formatting, but no problem. These smart tags are awesome. I'm going to click on the smart tag. I'm going to click on the smart tag here and say fill without formatting. And boom, there we have it. So the sum of the 2 smallest here would be 42, which if I checked it, I could click there, hold control and click there, and then come down to the status bar, and you can see it says sum 42. Now total possible equals SUM, all of those minus the 2 lowest. So the total possible, Control Enter, is going to be 300. I'm going to double click and send this down, point to the smart tag and say fill without formatting. All right, so now I can calculate my percentage. Well, that's the total. So this student got 218, given that we took the 2 smallest ones out, and we need to compare that to the 300. So no problem, equals 1 cell to my left, divided by, not 1 cell to my left, but I'm going to hit the F4 key to lock it, Control Enter. I'm going to double click and send it down. Point to the smart tag and say fill without formatting, but oh look, I pre-formatted it as percentage, so that's perfect. All right, so now decimal. Now we can do a VLOOKUP equals VLOOKUP. Hey, I'm going to look up this percentage, comma within this table. I'm going to highlight the first 2 and use Control Shift down arrow to highlight the whole table, and then F4 to lock it. Now notice this table is sorted with the percentage and then the decimal to return to the cell from smallest to biggest. All right, so we have our table array, comma, and column index. Well, I want to return the decimal from the second column. The 4th argument is approximate as default, so I leave it out. Control Enter, double click and send it down. You know, there is a keyboard shortcut to invoke the smart tag, it's a useless one. It's Alt-Shift F10. And then notice we want this O, this fill without formatting. So if I Alt-O, well, that didn't work. Control-Z, Control-Z. I did something wrong there. Let's do that again. Double-click and send it down. Alt-Shift F10, the most useless keyboard shortcut I know. And then let's just try hitting an O. I did Alt-O, but you just have to hit O. All right, so important thing about this VLOOKUP, if you're doing grading, a lot of us have like 0.63 here and maybe a 0.6. But if you set up your table like this for VLOOKUP for grading, then you get an NA here. So for the bottom one, if the decimal really is 0, you want to be sure and put a 0 here also, and then it will work perfectly. So that, in this example, we really saw this great small function. There's also an equivalent large function. So if you had some sales data and you wanted to add the 3 largest, you do large and then array constant 1, 2, 3. Let's go look at our next example. Now to get to our next sheet, we could use these scroll arrows, but there's a much better way. There is a keyboard shortcut. Notice this is the active sheet here. If I do Control Page Down, not only, Control Page Down, not only does it jump to the next sheet, but it exposes the sheet. So the Control Page Down to get to 13, Control Page Down. Control Page Up goes up one, so I'm on this 13 sheet here. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about formally about array formulas. Now, in this situation, we want the first price, and we have stocks, day 1 to day 5. So I want a 23 here, I want a 54 here, I want a $2.12 here. And so in essence, we're doing a lookup of the first non-blank cell. Well, we saw earlier how to use the match function. Now think about this. We're going to look something up in a row, and I'm going to use the match function to tell me it's the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth one. So if I could somehow have match look up the first non-empty cell, I could get, hey, 23 is in the second position, 54 is in the first position, and $2.12 is in the fifth position. So let's see how to do this using the match function. Equals match. Remember, we talked about match. It finds the relative position. Now, look up value and then look up array. Well, what are we going to look up? We can't write something like non-blank, right? So we're going to have to get a little tricky here. And I'm going to skip over the lookup value first and then comma and get to the lookup array here and see if we can trick our way through trying to figure out how to decipher or when there are non-empty cells. So I'm going to highlight that range, and now I'm going to compare it. By the way, it's going to be relative because we're going to copy down. But I want to ask the question, are any items in that row not empty? Now, not is a comparative operator, and the way you put like equal is a comparative operator, greater than or equal to. We saw those comparative operators earlier in this video, but not is less than, greater than. That means not. And the syntax for empty is double quote, double quote. Now, technically, double quote is a null text string, but it will work here because we're asking the question, is anything in there not empty? Right? So when we highlight this, remember we saw this earlier with logical formulas. Anytime you have a comparative operator like this, it's going to give us this, a bunch of trues and falses. So when I hit the F9 key, boom, true and true. Now, match function, we used it earlier in this video to do exact match. Well, exact match is perfect because if we have duplicates, which we do here, and you tell the match function to do an exact match, it will only find the first item. And actually, that's true for VLOOKUP too. If you have duplicates in a column and you say VLOOKUP or match do an exact match, it'll always find just the first one. Now I'm going to Control Z on that. I'm going to cheat and do the last argument here because I already know what it is. I want exact match for 0 and then close this off. Now I got to come over here and think of what in the world is going to be my lookup value. Well, to get a hint, let's just evaluate this little bit again. Actually, let's do our little trick here we learned earlier. Look up array, and I'm going to I click on the screen tip and it highlights that, and then I'm going to hit F9. Oh, I'm going to look up true. So Control Z and come here. Right? Now, before we enter, let's just enter this formula here. It gives us a value error. That value error says you forgot to tell Excel that this is a special kind of formula called an array formula. So I'll go back in edit mode. An array formula is from this part right here. Now, this is a comparative operator, and it's asking a question not of a single cell, but of a range of cells. Anytime you have an operation, and this is a comparative operator operation, it could be a math operation also. Anytime you have an operation on more than one cell at a time, that means it's an array formula. Now, there's a couple special functions that can handle array formulas without a special keystroke. We already saw how the sum product could do array calculations. Later we'll see in our next example lookup. Index and aggregate are also functions that sometimes can handle arrays. So match is not one of those special functions. So because we're doing an array operation here, we have to enter this with Control Shift and Enter. Now check this out. When you hold Control Shift, let's try it. Control Shift and then Enter. You are telling Excel I'm doing an array calculation. Now notice when I hit just Control Enter, value error is saying, hey, Excel's telling you you forgot to do that special keystroke. So I'm going to Control Shift Enter. That's me telling Excel I'm doing an array formula. Control Shift Enter. And if you look up in the formula bar, those curly brackets, that's Excel telling you, hey, I understood you did an array formula. Again, there's some notes down here. I'm going to, oh, well, look at that, 2. The answer is 2 because $23, the first non-empty cell, is in the second position. When I double-click and send this down, boom, the match function is doing exactly what we want. Now, what are we going to do with these relative positions? We're going to use a new lookup function called index. So we're going to come up here, and index is a lookup function, and you give it an array and tell it either row number or column number, and it will look up that value. So guess what? Here's all of our values right here. The array, comma. Now you either have a row number if your items were in rows or column number. Now index is great for doing a two-way lookup, but that's not what we're doing here. We have a one-way lookup, which means all the values in a row. So I'm going to skip over that argument by typing a comma, and there it is, the column number. The match will deliver a 2 because the first stock price is in column 1, 2. And there you go. Now, one thing about index. Index is one of those functions, as listed down here, that can handle array calculations without Control Shift Enter, but that's only if the array calculation is there. The fact that inside of the match function, our array calculation is in that lookup array, it trumps the fact that index can handle array, because match can't, unless you do what? Control Shift and Enter. You can see our curly brackets up there. I'm going to double click and send it down. That is just amazing. If I were to change this right here to 1, boom, that formula, that amazing array formula, is looking up the first non-blank cell to retrieve our first stock price. Now, what if you wanted to look up the last stock price? Let's go to our next sheet. This is 13. I'm going to use Control Page Down to get to 14. All right, we're going to see how to use the lookup function here. Now, we talked about over here, match function, we did exact match, right, for 0. If there are duplicates, exact match takes the first one. Well, we want the last one here. So we're going to take advantage of the fact that when you're doing lookup functions, either match, VLOOKUP, or in this case, we're going to see the lookup function. When you do approximate match, if you give the lookup, if you put a lookup value that's bigger than anything in the range, it takes the last one. And if you remember back, we had a VLOOKUP situation like this, where we gave it something very big and it always got the last one. So that's the logic behind what we're going to do here. All right, I'm going to use the lookup function. Now, the lookup function came before VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP. It's all the way back to the very first spreadsheet, the very first version, VisiCalc. But lookup can only do approximate match. You can't do an exact match. Oh, well, that's okay in this case. The nice thing about lookup is that it has two separate vectors. We have a lookup value and then a lookup vector and a result vector. That means you can give it two separate ranges instead of simply a table of ranges. Now I'm going to skip over the lookup value just like we did in our last example because the array magic is going to come in this lookup vector. All right. I'm going to highlight this whole range. Do the same thing. Not double quote, right? And then I'm going to highlight it and hit the F9 key, right? So we got trues and falses. Well, I can't, if I need to give lookup value a big number bigger than anything here, well, those aren't numbers. Those are trues and falses. So I'm going to Control Z. I'm going to convert them to numbers by putting parentheses around this because we need to force the comparative operator to calculate before our math operator. And I'm going to do 1 divided by. Now, what in the world will that do? What's 1 divided by true? 1. 1 divided by false will give us a divide by 0 error. So let's check this out. I'm going to hit the F9 key. Actually, let's try our little trick again, right? Highlight our, click our screen tip and then F9. Divide by 0, 1, divide by 0. Now, divide by 0 usually is a nightmare in formulas because once you get some error, it trumps everything, but not for lookup in the lookup vector. It'll have no problem with. Now, what numbers do we have here? 1, 1, 1. Well, we want the last one, right? Well, lookup functions when doing approximate match, if you give the lookup value a bigger number than anything here, it'll always find the last one. Well, what's the first number bigger than 1? 2. I'm going to Control Z, and I'm going to come to the lookup value and put a 2. All right, so this is where using lookup is going to come in handy because we have a lookup vector, and guess what? That lookup vector, in essence, will decide the position. It'll look for the 2. It'll find the last one here. Our result vector, I type comma, and then boom, highlight those. All right, and here's the cool thing. Lots of cool things about lookup, right? But I don't have to do Control-Shift-Enter because it's programmed to handle array calculations. I'm going to Control-Enter and double-click and send it down. That is simply amazing. If I deleted this and put a 1 here and a 2.12 here, boom, it gets the last and the first. All right, so we saw lookup in an array calculation. This one didn't require Control-Shift-Enter because lookup can handle array calculations. We saw match and index together, and we saw that we had to do Control-Shift-Enter. So some array formulas require Control-Shift-Enter and some don't. It just takes practice. All right, now let's go to our next example. All right, I'm actually going to use my scroll arrows here and scroll over. I want to expose sheets 15, 16, and 17. We're going to talk about pivot tables. We're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 great pivot table calculations. Now, this first example, I'm going to do a pivot table for yearly percentage change calculations. So here's our data set. We have, serial numbers and sales. And we need to roll these up into years, show the total for each year, and then the amount of the change for each year and the percentage change. This is hard to do with formulas, but pivot tables, totally easy. Now, the first thing about pivot tables, and we should all know this, is you have to have a proper data set. Field names at the top of each column, records and rows, and blanks all the way around the data set. Once you have that set up, pivot tables are amazing. Now, what are pivot tables for? When you're doing calculations with criteria. In this case, we want to add them all up, show the amount of the change and the percentage change by year, right? So our criteria is 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. All right, so let's go ahead and look on the insert menu, pivot table, pivot table. Now we could click that. The keyboard shortcut for pivot table involves the Alt, A-L-T, Alt keyboard shortcuts. Now when I hit Alt, look what happens up here. In 2007, 10, and 13, these screen tips pop up. To get to the insert, you need an N. To get to the V, the pivot table, you need a V, and pivot table, you need a T. So here it is, Escape, Alt, NVT, and Alt keyboard shortcuts are in succession, so you don't hold Alt NVT down, you hit it in succession. I'm going to do this on a new worksheet and click OK. Now, pivot tables are amazing. They even give you a little picture here. There's the row headers, there's the column headers. Those are the criteria. The internal part of a pivot table is where you make your calculation. Here are the field names. We only have 2 column labels, row labels, and that's where you do our calculation. It's as simple as dragging. Look at that. Boom. It even gives you a little picture there with that yellow. Now, we need this rolled up into years. The grouping feature in pivot tables is amazing. All right, I'm going to right-click that pivot table where the date field is and point to group. Then I'm going to say months. No, I want years, so I'm going to uncheck months and select years. All right, I'm actually going to control and roll. Change this over here, right? Now we need sales, and just like that, we drag it down to the values areas. That is amazing. Now I'm going to drag this down 1, 2, and 3 times. The great thing about pivot tables, you can drag the same field multiple times down in the values and do any calculation you want on any of these. Now I'm going to use the value field setting dialog box to change the name, the format for this field here. I'm going to right click value field settings. Then I'm going to come up here to custom name and I'm going to type sales. But guess what? Sales is already the name of the field, so the pivot table won't let you have the word sales. But guess what? Space. A space will trick it, and now we can have the word sales right there. All right, I'm going to come down to number formatting, and I'm going to change it to something like currency, no decimals. Click OK. Click OK. All right, now this one needs to be the amount of the change, so I'm going to right-click, value field setting. Whoops, we'll do that in just a second. Value field settings right here. I'm going to change this to amount of change, and I'm not going to change the function here. I'm going to come back to show values as, and there's all sorts of amazing calculations. I'm going to scroll down, and I want difference from, and it's going to ask me from which field. I want the difference. Remember, I want to show the amount of change in this column from each year or date, because that's the name of that field there, and I want to do it based on not 2009. That means we'd show the difference for each one of these from year 2009, but I want to do it from the previous, and then click OK. Absolutely amazing. I should have done number formatting. Right click value field settings and then number. I'm going to say currency and 0. Click OK, click OK. I'm going to close this. If you ever need to bring it back out, you right-click show field list. All right, on this one, right-click, and instead of using the values, actually, let's use value field settings again, because we're going to have to change a bunch of things. I'm going to change the name to percentage change. The number format will come out when we apply our show values as. So I'm going to say show values as, and I want calculation, percentage difference from. The date, previous, we're good to go. Click OK, and sure enough, it even applies that percentage change. That is pretty amazing. That kind of calculation from that original data set, if we look back over here, with serial numbers is difficult to do with formulas. Now, a couple things. Let's not leave our sheet 2. Let's call this a pivot table 1 or something like that. And this is annoying. It says row labels. I'd really like it to say years or dates or something like that. You can come up to design. These are the pivot table context sensitive ribbons. Options, there's lots of great things there. Design. We go over to report layout and show in tabular. What's great about show in tabular is it will show the field names. All right, now it really should say year, so I'm going to type year there. We actually could have gotten away with not changing the format here, because I'm going to change the name of this field to year and then enter. All right, let's go look at another great example on sheet 16. We want to do a pivot table for running total in. Again, here is a serial number, date column, and sales, and we need to roll these up into months and show the running total. All right, so this whole column has nothing but 2012. I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-NVT, and enter. I'm going to drag the date down to the row labels. Actually, let me click here and scroll and roll in. Click back in there. Notice it goes away. If you click out, it goes away. If it really is gone, you can right-click Show Field List. All right, now we're going to roll these up. Right-click Group. And now I want months, but I'm also going to select years just in case there's a rogue date from a different year, then I can see that. And now it adds an extra year and date. So I have months, and I really want to only see months. There's no other years in there, so I'm going to uncheck this. I'm going to come up to Design and immediately change it to Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Now let's drag Sales down to our values, and then we can right-click Value Field Settings. And let's type Running Total. And we're going to do Show Values As. And down here somewhere is amazing. Running total in. There's even a percentage running total in. All right, and base field is the date. I'm going to click OK. So there we have our, oops, probably should have done number formatting also. All right, again, that's hard to do because what? We have serial numbers back in our original data set here. So these kind of calculations with formulas, certainly they're possible. They're just a lot faster with pivot tables. I'm going to double click this sheet and call it Pivot Table 2. All right, our last example on sheet number 17 for pivot tables, we're going to see 3 great examples. We're going to do cross tabulation, percentage of row total, and percentage of column totals. I'm going to click in one cell in the data set. This is a big data set, right? Lots of fields. Here's our goal, actually. We're going to take customer age and roll it up into increments of 10. So we're going to group this integer field for customer age, and then we're going to cross-tabulate. That'll be the row label. The column label will be payment method, and then we'll dump sales inside the inside table and see a cross-tabulation, and we'll do a bunch of other calculations. All right, you ready? Alt-NVT, enter. All right, let's drag our customer age down into row labels. I'm going to come over here and group these. Right-click Group. I'm going to start at 15 and go all the way to 65 in increments of 10. 15, 65, 10, and then click OK. Now I can drag my sales over here. I mean, just that is totally cool right there. But now let's take payment method and drag it to the column labels. By the way, why is it called a pivot table? Because it's easy to pivot it, right? Look at that. American Express, the grouped years, absolutely awesome. All right, we're going to cross-tabulate. We got a variable here and a variable here. Ooh, row labels, column labels, don't like it at all. Design, report layout, show and tabular. Now we see payment method and customer age. Now that's pretty cool right there. I'm going to close this. But now I'd like to see percentage of the total. So I want each one of these payment methods, I want to see it as a percentage of that total. Notice this is a column, and that's the column total. So I want to make a second and then a third pivot table, even showing percentage of row total. Watch this. You can copy and paste pivot tables. I'm going to copy it, Control-C, and then paste it right here. Now all we have to do, we've done all the heavy lifting, is inside the interior where the value was. And by the way, right-click Show Field. We only have one value here, so we only have one calculation to change. I'm going to right-click, and instead of using that value field setting, since it's already all done here, I want to go Show Values As. Now let me scroll up here. Right-click, Show Values As, and look at that. Just amazing array of calculations that you can do with pivot tables. And I want to say percentage of column total. Boom, just like that. So I can see my numbers here and my percentages here. So for in this age group, right, 16% used American Express, 21 used PayPal, 42 used Visa. All right, let's do the same trick again. Actually, let's copy this one. Control-C, Control-V. I'm going to right-click, Show Values As, and how about percentage of row total. And boom, these are the 100%. These are the percentage. Now, so there are three examples here. I do want to show you one last thing about pivot tables. I'm going to copy this one. I'm doing this one on the fly. We never did the report filter, and all it means, right-click, value, show field list. Report filter means, hey, can we add a filter to the whole thing? Well, of course you can. I'm going to go by region. And so up here, we have now a filter for this whole report here. Now, what's happening up here? How many variables are we considering when we make this sum calculation? 2. So this number has gone through the data set. It found only the sales that are in the age group 25 to 34 made by Discover. So there's 2 variables. So in essence, it's adding with 2 criteria. Here it's doing another percentage calculation with 2 criteria, and same with here. But now when you add this right here, that means 3. 1, 2, 3. So it just means adding with 3 criteria. Now, right now, there's no distinction. It's all of them. But if I come down here and select Midwest, boom, I have filtered my report. Now it's showing me a total with 3 calculations. Now we're going to end this. This is the last pivot table, and then we have a couple other advanced Excel. But that really, in your mind, if you don't have in your mind what is the meaning or definition of a pivot table, it's doing some calculation with 1 or more criteria. Easy to do with pivot tables, usually much easier to do than with formulas. All right, I better name this PT3. And now let's go to our next example. Use my scroll arrows over here for the sheets. I'm going to click on the sheet 18. Now, we've got a great topic here. Creating and using defined names with keyboards. Well, what is a defined name? Well, first let's look at a formula for adding. Alt equals is the keyboard shortcut for auto sum, and I simply want to add, right like that. Well, what is that? That's a range of cells. A defined name is to replace that range of cells with a name, a word. So I want to call that range of cell units and this range of cells invoice date. I'm going to click escape. All right, and here's one way to do it. Highlight the range, and this is called the name box. Click in the name box, type units, and then enter. Now if I click in some other cell, and I go to this drop down, now I have a defined name. When I select units, boom, that now is called units. You can use it in formulas. Now, what if you want to edit that, or you create the wrong name, or you want to delete it? Formulas, name manager. Now I'm going to teach you keyboard shortcuts. The keyboard shortcut to get to the name manager is Control F3. Now that's a lot of print areas. So way down here is units. All right, so you can see it says units, and you can click edit and do whatever you want. I'm going to click cancel. I'm going to delete that. All right? Are you sure? Yes. Because now I'm going to show you keyboard shortcuts. If you use a lot of defined names, the keyboard shortcuts are great. Because look, the field name is right at the top, and I want to call this column right here that particular name. So you simply highlight the names at the top, directly at the top, and the columns, and you use Control-Shift-F3. Control-Shift-F3. Notice the F3 key is used for all the name keyboards. And look at that, it's polite. I'm putting this up here. It says, hey, where are your names? It's only in the top row, not the left column, just the top row, right? And click OK. Just like that, I have invoice date and units. What's great about that is when you have lots of columns. And I'll show you another example in just a moment. Now I'd like to sum the transactions just on this date, 6/6/2011. So I'm going to use the sum ifs. Now sum ifs, where's the sum range? Well, watch this. If I highlight that, it comes up units. Absolutely convenient. Comma, the criteria range. Now let's say you're not in shot and you can't highlight that. And not only that, you forgot the name you can use the keyboard F3. So F3 gives me a list of all of my names I can put in my formula. So I'm going to say invoice date. Just like that, I have my criteria range. Now, comma, the criteria right there. And then I'm going to hit enter. So 81. Now, let's come over and look at another great use for defined names. If I hit F2 here, you can see units and invoice date. Some people like to have defined names because it tells you exactly what the function is looking at. Here's another example similar to that. I have revenue and total expenses. I'm simply going to highlight those two cells, Control Shift F3, and boom, top row. Now, here's another way to tell. If I click in that cell right there, I can see the word revenue up there. When I click in that cell, I can click total expenses. I can use the drop down and say revenue, and boom. By the way, this is a great, if you have a huge workbook, you can use define names as go to. So if I wanted to, on a different sheet, go to units, I could simply click it and it would take me to that other sheet. All right, so now we want to do our net income formula here, equals, and I'm going to type REV. Now notice the drop down in 2007 and later, that little F of X means function, that's the icon for function, and there's a dog tag. That's for, that tells you it's a defined name. So when I type V, now I see that it's highlighted, I can simply hit tab, minus T-O-T, and then tab. So I got total expenses. And there we go. That's a formula where you can clearly see it's revenue minus total expenses. I guess I should have mentioned this. Here's some rules. You can't have spaces. You can't have some characters. And a few other rules there for defined names, but using keyboard shortcuts, totally awesome. Let's go to our next topic. I'm going to click on the sheet 19, and we are going to talk about recorded macros. Now, recording macros in Excel allows you to do something, and if the macro recorder is turned on, it will follow you around like a tape recorder and record what you do as code, and then you can replay that code to do something. This is great for repetitive tasks. And let's just look over here on M1. Let's say you get the same report every single week and you need to format it. Well, that takes a bunch of steps. You need to add an extra column with the formula, right? But if you do it once with the macro recorder turned on, you can store that macro and play it later, and it will do all those steps for you. Now, over here, there's some notes here, and the problem is in 2007 or later, if you look up here on the title bar, I have the file extension .xlsx. You can't record a macro in .xlsx files. You can only record them in .xlsm. M is for macro. So I'm actually have to save as. I'm going to hit the F12 key. I'm going to save as, and I'm going to change the file type to .xlsm. Click save. Not only that, but there's a developer ribbon, and that has to be turned on in 2010 and 13. You can right-click. So if you're here, you can right-click any ribbon and say customize the ribbon. And then over here on the right, you check your developer ribbon. In 2007, you have to go File, Options, and then the first general area, the checkbox for developer ribbon is there. Now in this video, we want to see how to record using relative and absolute cell references. So many people, when they learn how to do a macro, they just learn absolute. So we really want to see how to do both in one macro. Now let's go over to the sheet M3, and then we want to go to the developer ribbon. Over here, we can start the macro using that button. We can start the macro using this button. If you don't have the developer, you can actually go to View and then over here to Macros, record macros, view the macros to run them, and this is the important button we're going to talk about. But I'm going to talk about it on the developer ribbon. Most people record their macro and they don't come up and click this. When you click that, it's orange. That means it's recording relative references. If it's not selected, it means absolute. Here's what I mean. If we want to format this report and add an extra column with a formula, if I'm running the macro and I click in cell D1, the macro just said, hey, click in cell D1. That button is turned on, and the cell is already selected, and I click in D3. It didn't record select D3. It said goes 2 cells below. So that's an example of selecting using relative references. Really, the difference between absolute and relative when you're recording a macro is all about the selection of cells. Now that's going to be important here because we're going to have a variable height table and we want to format and add an extra column. Let's look on M4 here. See how short that is? We want our macro to automatically format and add a formula no matter what the height. All right, I'm going to turn this off and go back over the sheet. Now how we're going to do this is I'm going to do a simple macro. I just want to emphasize how to switch back and forth between relative and absolute. We're going to add a little bit of formatting. Of course, you could add as much format as you want. Add a field name and a formula and copy it down. Then select a cell and turn the macro off. And then we'll test it on these other variable length tables. Now, to start this macro, I'm going to start. First thing I'm going to do in the macro is click in cell D1 absolutely and add a field name. So I'm going to make sure before I start the macro that the cursor is somewhere else. Now I can start it using this, or of course you can use this button down here. You got to name your macro. I'm going to call this format report. I'm going to give it a keyboard shortcut. It's already got control, so I'm going to do Shift R. Personal macro workbook. That is a hidden workbook on everybody's Excel, whatever computer they work on. And you could, if you store it in personal macro, it means it'll be available. And anytime you open Excel on this computer, you could say a new workbook or this workbook. I'm going to say personal, so I can use this anytime. Normally, I write a long description because I'm shooting a video. I'm not going to do that. All right, now when I click OK, this macro recorder is going to record everything I do. So I'm going to click OK. Now, notice this says stop up here and down here also. I'm going to click in cell D1 and type Celsius. Enter. Now, what I just did there was, did I spell it wrong? I sure did spell it wrong. You know, I'm going to leave it like that. If I went back and changed it, it would be fine. It would just record that, but no problem. I recorded D1. When I hit enter, it said select D2, which is fine because that's what I want to do. I'm going to add this formula equals, and what I want to do is convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. So I'm going to use the convert function. Convert. I'm going to get a number. Well, there's the number right there. Comma, the from unit is going to be capital F. There's a great, in 2010, you have this great drop down that helps you. Comma, in earlier versions, you had to go look it up in help, right? And the to unit is capital C, right? And then I'm going to close parentheses. I'm going to control enter. This is all happening in exactly cell D2. Now I'm going to copy it. And I want to copy it down. If I were to drag this down, it would not work because it would record absolutely. Now I'm still in absolute mode, right? I'm going to click in this cell here. I'm still in absolute. In the macro record, it said select cell C2. But now I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut to trick the absolute recorder. Because look, it's still absolute. If I control down arrow, that jumps not to the whatever cell it is, it jumps to the bottom of the current region, and that's how it's recorded in the code. So I'm going to control down arrow. In the code, it didn't say select cell C94. It said go to the bottom of the current region. Well, watch this. I really want to select this cell and then use a keyboard shortcut to highlight all the way to the top where that formula is and then paste. But if I was to click right there, it would be D94. So now this is where I hit relative. Now, when I click in this cell right here, it didn't say, please select D94. It said go 1 to my right. Actually, it said offset, add 1 column. Now I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Control-Shift-Up arrow, which is, again, it's not a keyboard that says select D2. It says go to the top until I find the very first thing that's there. And select it because I held Shift. It said do a selection. All right, now I'm going to Control V. Now I'm going to turn this off because everything else is going to be absolute. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Control Home to go up to A1, and I'm going to highlight. This is absolute, and I'm going to do bold. Now, you could do whatever other formatting you want, and that's fine. And now, before I hit stop recording, I want to select off to the side, and I'm going to do it absolutely E1. So now I'm going to hit stop. Now, I want to go look at the code and just take a moment to look at that code, but guess what? If I did the keyboard shortcut to show macros, by the way, there's the list of macros right there. Alt F8 is the keyboard. And there it is. It says personal.xlsb explanation point format report. That means it's sitting in the personal workbook. If I said edit, which means I want to look at it, it's going to tell me forget it, pal. You have to unhide it first. Right? So I'm going to click escape. Now I'm going to go to view, unhide. You always wondered what this button is? It's because this personal workbook is always hidden on your computer waiting for your macro. So I'm going to click on this and click unhide. Now I'm in this one. Now I can use the keyboard shortcut Alt F8. I can look at this. I'm going to click edit, and there's my code. There's the name that I'll see in the drop down. Select range D1.select. Notice it's hard coded. That's D1. Notice this active cell dot. Well, so it got the. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, I could fix it here. Celsius. Fix it in the Celsius. I think that's how you spell Celsius. All right, then we select the D2. We put this formula in. Again, selection, and it says select C2. And then look, selection dot end XL down dot select. That's when we jump to the bottom of the current region. Then once we got that, we said active cell offset, please add 1 column. Add 0 rows. All right, so that was the relative part of it. And then range selection dot end up, that was when we did Control Shift Up arrow. Again, that's a great trick. And then the rest of this is absolute. All right, I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to hide this workbook right here so it's hidden. Now we're going to try this. I'm going to come over here to M4. Remember, it doesn't matter where your cursor is when you run this macro because the very first action is select D1. So you ready? It was Control Shift R. Oh. Control Shift R is a keyboard shortcut for my video recorder. Oh my heavens. No problem. I'm going to, since I can't use the keyboard shortcut because it's it's the keyboard for my video, I'm going to go up to developer and macros or show the list, Alt F8. And now I can simply run it, And there it is, just like that. I get my formulas, my formatting, and my field name. If I go over to this, a different sheet, this is a different height for this table. I can say macros, that one run, and boom, it works perfectly. So that's a great trick about recording macros, when to use the relative and absolute. Our final, I'm going to use my arrows here, our final topic here is going to be topic 20. Click on sheet 20, and our last topic is a little short one, number formatting for formula inputs. Now we have formula input. This is the price per item or per unit, right? And I want to multiply each one of these number of units sold times this price. But in this situation, I don't want a label up here that says price per unit. And sometimes you have spreadsheets where you really need to save space. But I do want a label because this is just sitting out there, I don't know what it is. So I'm going to select this cell and I'm going to use custom number formatting to add a label in the cell. Now, when you do any number formatting, we're going to do custom number formatting, and we're going to use text to say per unit. And we'll put it in quotes, but it will appear on the surface of the spreadsheet, not as sitting in the cell with a number, so we can still use the number in our calculations. All right, ready? Control-1 is the keyboard shortcut for format cells. I go down to custom, and then in the type text box, I'll highlight general, and I'm going to type 0.00 to show the formatting, and then in double quotes, space, price per, oops, I can't type, price per unit, and then end double quotes. Now notice you can see the preview up here, pretty cool. Click OK. That means the column is not wide enough, so I'm going to open it up, and there it is. Actually, Control-1, I want some to indicate that this is money, so I'm going to use the $sign. So $0.00 just means show a $sign with 2 decimals. All right, so there we go. And now check this out. If I go equals this times this, absolutely awesome. Now let me show you one last cool trick. Sometimes if you have a whole column of numbers and you have the same formula in all of them, instead of putting it in a single cell and copying it down, you can highlight all the cells and then the active cell, so equals whatever your formula is, F4 key, and then Control-Enter populates all those cells with the formula. All right, actually, custom number formatting and number formatting is an unbelievably varied and complex topic. I have a great video link here if you want to learn all sorts of cool tricks about number formatting. Wow, that was epic, the most epic video, like an hour and 50 minutes, 20 advanced Excel, accounting, and finance topics for the